All right, today we're diving into what is basically a theological detective story. It's this fascinating logical puzzle that pops up when you look at two of the world's most influential religious books and find, well, something really unexpected. And it all boils down to this one central question. See, to get to the bottom of it, we can't just guess. We've got to follow a really strict logical path, a path that's paved with historical facts and, crucially, the very specific rules of theology. Okay, so this is where the puzzle stops being abstract and gets really concrete. Look at this. On the left, you've got a verse from the Quran. And on the right, a passage from the Jewish Mishnah? I mean, the phrasing is, wow, it's incredibly similar. We're not talking about some general vague idea here. This is a very specific ethical rule that shows up in both texts with an almost identical sentiment.
So, here's our game plan for cracking this thing open. First, we'll dig into that surprising overlap. Then we'll lay out what I'm calling the rules of the game from a theological standpoint. After that, we'll see how those rules box us into a serious dilemma with only two possible exits. And finally, we'll see how a classic logic tool helps pick a path forward.
All right, Section 1. Let's start by introducing the main characters in this puzzle: the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, and the Talmud, a foundational text of Rabbinic Judaism. Now, this is maybe the most important first clue: the timeline. Look at the dates. The core texts of the Talmud, they were put together roughly between 200 and 500 AD. The revelations of the Quran, those start around 610 AD. This isn't up for debate, it's just a historical fact. The rabbinic text was around for centuries before the Quran existed. Okay, now for the next piece of this puzzle. To really get what's going on, you have to understand the specific rules for how divine communication works, at least according to Islamic theology. And it really boils down to two key ideas. The first concept is something called wahi. Think of it as divine revelation, a direct message from God. But here's the critical part. According to the Quran itself, this isn't for just anyone. This special line of communication is granted only to prophets. It's not wisdom or inspiration, it's a direct pipeline to the divine, and it's super exclusive. And that brings us to the second big idea, the fetra. This is basically an interval, a gap in prophethood that falls right between Jesus and Muhammad. Islamic tradition is very clear on this. For about 600 years, no prophets were sent. Now, think back to that timeline we just saw. When was the Talmud being written? Yep, smack dab in the middle of the fetra. So let's connect the dots here. The rabbis who wrote the Talmudic material, they lived during the fatra, that period with no prophets. This means, according to the rules of Islamic theology, there's just no way they could have received wahi. They weren't prophets, so they couldn't get that direct divine revelation. Okay, so now all the pieces are on the board, right? We have the historical fact, the Talmud came first, and we have the theological rules, revelation is only for prophets, and there were no prophets when the Talmud was being written. You can probably see where this is going. This is where the trap snaps shut, and the real dilemma begins. So here's the core contradiction in a nutshell. The Quran is believed to be 100% pure divine revelation, but it has stuff in it that we first see in texts written by, well, non-prophets. And not only that, but they were writing during a time when, according to the theology, divine revelation wasn't even happening. Logically, something's got to give. All of these things just can't be true at once. This leads us to a really tough question, one you can't just ignore. How did material from a human, non-prophetic source end up in a text that is claimed to be purely divine revelation? How does that work? And this is it. This is the heart of the Talmudic dilemma. The argument lays out two, and only two, mutually exclusive options. Let's call them A and B. Option A, you could argue that, hey, maybe God did give revelation to those non-prophetic rabbis, but that would mean breaking the Quran's own rules about wahi and the fitra. Or there's option B. Muhammad came across these rabbinic traditions through perfectly normal human means, talking to people, hearing stories, and then incorporated them. But if that's the case, then it means the Quran isn't purely divine. It has human sources. So we're at a fork in the road. Which way do you go? Well, the argument we're looking at here pulls out a famous tool from the logic toolbox to figure out the most straightforward path. And that tool is Occam's razor. You've probably heard of it. The basic idea is super simple. When you have competing explanations, the one with the fewest new assumptions, the simplest one, is usually the one to bet on. Don't add extra layers of complexity if you don't have to. So let's apply that razor to our two options. The argument's conclusion is that option B is just simpler.
It doesn't force you to rewrite the rules of revelation or tie yourself in theological knots. It just fits with what we know about history, that stories and oral traditions were flowing all over the place in 7th century Arabia.
Now, according to the source material, this conclusion isn't a small thing. It creates some pretty major theological ripple effects. It calls into question some core Islamic doctrines, like the uniqueness of the Quran, the whole idea of divine preservation, and how revelation works. Basically, the argument is that how you solve this one little puzzle could shake the very foundations of how the holy text is understood.
And that really leaves us with one last thing to chew on. This whole dilemma, this whole logical trap, it only exists because we started with a certain set of premises, some historical, some theological. So it really makes you wonder, right? When a logical framework seems to corner you into a really challenging conclusion, what might that tell you about the foundations you started with in the first place? Definitely something to think about.